Well, welcome today to the launch of Hijabistan by Sabyn Javeri. My name is Maha Phillips. I'm delighted to be talking to Sabyn today about her new book. Sabyn, for those of you who don't know her, wears many hats. She is an academic, she's a novelist, she's a short story writer. We're going to talk about several aspects of her new book, but just to give you a brief overview, she is an award-winning short story writer, and she's been published in many anthologies. She's the author of the novel Nobody Killed Her, which came out in 2017. And she's also an academic. She's a professor of literature and creative writing at Habib University in Karachi. And in fact, she launched the first anthology of creative writing and new voices in Pakistan there for university students. So I'm delighted to say hello to Sabyn. Her new book is very, very interesting and unexpectedly so, because it sort of, just from my reading, takes a lot of stereotypes that all of us have about women who wear the hijab, wherever we are in the world, and negates them and asks us to ask questions about them. So I'd like to start today by asking Sabyn about where you sort of got the inspiration for this book and some of the trends and themes that you've explored in it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Maha. Thank you for that generous introduction, especially coming from you, since you're such an acclaimed author yourself and such an overachiever. So the inspiration for Hijabistan, okay. So it began by this story I had read by an Urdu writer, Rashid Jahan, who wrote this story called A Visit to Delhi, Delhi Ki Sair, which was published in a very controversial anthology called Angare, which made her the bad girl of Urdu literature, which she's still called today. And this story was written in the 1930s. And this was a story about a woman who has never been to Delhi. And she gets a chance to go because her husband is going there for some work. And she's hardly ever stepped out of the zanana. The condition is that she would be wearing a full veil, a covered head to toe in a burqa. However, her husband leaves her there at the platform along with the luggage. And she realizes that she is being more harassed than the mem saabs who are walking around without the hijab. And this is a monologue she has with herself that, this wretched burqa, ye kisi kaam ka nahi hai, what use are you? She keeps on saying to the veil. So I thought this was really interesting. And at the same time, I work in a university, so I had many students who would tell me that, they wear the hijab more for social mobility rather than for reasons of spirituality or piety. So that was another aspect I was seeing. So just exploring that connection got me thinking that, there's a theme over here that I would like to explore. I started researching, looking for stories of women who wore the hijab, their experiences in life. And I began to realize that the hijab is more than a garment. The hijab is not about the veil as much it is about veiling. About suppressing our desires, our will, covering the plurality that is inside us, that we can be this and we can be that. We don't have to be limited. So that is how the ball got rolling. And as I researched more and more, I became more interested in the metaphorical interpretation of what hijab means to Pakistani women, then Muslim women I knew in the UK, and that's how it kind of expanded from there on.
That's really interesting, and I, reading this, did not know how much research you had done until I spoke to you afterwards, but a lot of this is based on women that you've researched and spent time looking at. Can you talk a little bit about where your research took you and why it was important to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm lucky enough to work in a university where I get to meet a lot of anthropologists, sociologists, and often colleagues would say, oh, I did this case study, or I went on this, field study, and I met so-and-so. So I had access to a lot of sociological research, anthropological research. I started looking at some case studies, and one of the stories in this collection called Radha, which we talked about earlier, is the story of of a medical student who dropped out of medical school because she found an alternate profession which she found was more empowering and which she compared to healing as well. And she was working as a sex worker. And she thought that was more enabling for her than to go through a medical degree 5 years later and still be treated as not equal to her male colleagues in a hospital. So I thought that was really interesting. Obviously, these stories are not printed as is. I have dramatized it because I think fiction gives you that artistic license to like really, make the characters much more interesting. There was another very disturbing case study. A colleague was doing some research on women in prison. And I heard about a woman who was in a prison for mentally disturbed patients, a kind of an asylum. And this is the story of, it's called The Urge, and it's about a woman who used her burqa to steal. She was a kleptomaniac, and she felt the burqa was very empowering, the hijab was very empowering because it gave her access to things that she could not otherwise normally have. And then from there on, I dramatized the stories and, they took different shapes. But yeah, those are some of the stories that really stick out in my mind.
And I can tell you from reading it that if you read The Urge, you're not going to sleep for a while because it really does sucker punch you at the end. It has a tremendous ending.
Yeah, it's a very disturbing story. Yeah. In fact, a few people asked me, what kind of imagination do you have? Yeah.
It's not clear?
It's not.
Sound is not clear?
Thoda loud kar.
Is that better? Okay, do you want to try? Is yours okay?
Ab behtar hai? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So, for me, another interesting aspect of this was the fact that these women are completely universal in some way. They're just women going about their business. In some stories, the hijab plays an important, a significant role. In others, it's almost matter of fact in the background. These women are grasping with the issues that women everywhere face. Was that important to you to kind of bring out, the diversity of what women who wear the hijab, how diverse they are, and also were you trying to sort of talk about stereotypes and how easy it is to stereotype women who wear the hijab?
Yes, absolutely, both actually. One, I felt that, yes, you can't stereotype women who wear the hijab. You can't just automatically assume that, just because a woman wears the hijab, she's going to be submissive or this is how she's going to be. The women in this anthology, the hijab is just those who do wear it. It doesn't define their identity, it's not oppressing them. In fact, it's enabling them. There are stories where the hijab is an oppressor too, but again, I've tried to bring about a diverse outlook, but also I think more importantly, I have looked at the hijab as the divide between these women and society, between these women and men, between these women and other women. So that is what I was trying to explore, that what is it that we are trying to hide? Because the hijab, the Arabic root of the word actually means to cover, to veil, to hide something. And I wanted to look at it, what is it that we're trying to hide? What is it that we don't want anyone to know? The stories that we don't want to tell. That's what this collection looks at.
And that's great. And one of the things that I took away from reading, for example, a story like Coach Annie, was that the hijab can actually be empowering. So this is the story about a woman who's losing her hair and starts using the hijab to cover herself and then finds it a way of kind of developing an identity for herself. And there's other stories where it becomes a very political act.
Yeah.
But what was interesting for me was that these aren't stories about women, well, certainly in some cases there, but they're not. It's not a case that all women in this book are embracing the hijab for religious purposes. Mm-hmm. They kind of have all these different nuanced reasons and narratives. Again, did you want to get across that point, that it's not necessarily a religious choice?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think the hijab, at least in the part of the world where we live, has very little to do with piety. A lot of my students use it for social mobility. They use it because they feel they get less harassed, not harassed on public transport. They use it because it's comfortable. But very few people I know actually wear it for religious reasons. I mean, I'm not saying that nobody does. Of course, there are people who do, but not everybody. It means different things to different people. And the story that you're talking about, Coach Annie, it's also about, how it sort of becomes a part of you sometimes, and at other times, there's another story called The Headscarf and Her, which is about a student at a foreign university who feels that people cannot look beyond her hijab. They cannot take her for who she is because her hijab is so, it's like defining her. And the professor will always look to her when he's talking about Muslim women or when he's talking about the Muslim world, because she feels that just because she wears the hijab, she's speaking for the entire Muslim world. And that's very annoying to her. So.
And you have characters who, I mean, certainly there are women who get oppressed in this book. It's not all, funny stories, but there are characters who refuse to be victims, and I really got a sense of that from The Date, which is another story about a woman who uses her position to sort of, it's a story about lust and financial transactions and so on, but she really is not a victim in any way, shape, or form. She knows what she's doing, and she's using her hijab in a certain way. And I just, I got that sense too, that you were writing about women who are not victims, who are very much independent and empowered in certain cases.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I was watching TV some time ago, and every channel I switched to, there was a woman crying. Literally every channel I switched to, there was a woman crying, or there was a woman lamenting about her destiny, or there was, another woman being horrible to another woman, or, something like that was going on, or someone was crying. And I thought, hold on. Why do we always show our women as these roti dhoti victims? I mean, there are women who come to my house to help me with housework, who have 7 kids, and they are feisty like anything. They can take on the whole world. They whip their husbands' asses. I mean, they really know what they want. So I wanted to show an alternate point of view that, you can be in a situation where, yes, you do not have a lot of choice, but even the fact that you think of yourself as empowered, you try to take control, you try to think of yourself as, someone in charge, whether it is through swearing or whether it is through anything else, I mean, it's all about how you look at it. You don't necessarily have to be a victim. So yeah, I wanted to bring that in. There's a story in it called An Irreplaceable Loss, which is about a maid who's working in a new household, and it's a very kind of a humorous, satirical look at, what she thinks of the new baji, how she thinks the new baji is a joke, and she's like, oh, these new bajis are the same, all these bajis are the same, they must have like some baji checklist or something, and, so just try to show things from another perspective as well.
That's a very funny story, yeah. And tell me, I mean, you're a short story writer, and you've written a novel, and is there sort of one form that's more appealing to you than another? I mean, clearly, short stories is a very comfortable place for you.
Yes, I love the short story form. And I think that might be to do with the fact that I grew up in a house where my mother loved reading and writing, and she had a huge collection of Urdu literature. And the short story form is very popular in the Urdu canon of literature. Ismat Chughtai, Rashid Jahan, they have, really mastered. Manto have really, Ghulam Abbas. There's so many beautiful, wonderful Urdu story writers, and I grew up reading that. And I think that, at some level, influenced me and made me more comfortable with this form. So I do. It's my first love. Yeah.
So I think in a minute Sabyn might read for us, but I just wanted to have a sense of sort of what questions might... Raise your hand if you've got a question for Sabyn. Great. So we get to the questions. Thank you. Sabyn, will you do a reading?
Okay. All right. So you'll have to tell me when to stop.
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from the first story, which is called The Date. And this is about an office worker who, well, I think maybe I won't say too much because I'll let you all read the story. I'm just going to read a little bit and you can read the rest yourself. All right. Okay, The Date. If you had peeked in through the dusty gray windows only a few minutes earlier, you would have seen a middle-aged man and a young woman struggling with each other. But no, it wasn't what you think it was. He wasn't particularly forceful, and she was not really shy. What was taking place was actually in custom with what tradition demanded. A girl should not give her body away too easily, and a man should show a bit of force. And so they went back and forth, tussling and tossing, each knowing in their heart of hearts that this was a mere formality. Like any other transaction in this part of the world, sex outside of marriage too had its norms, which had to be observed. But now the two bodies lay still in the shadowy Karachi flat, one pale as ivory, the other like melting dark chocolate, both breathing heavily. Every now and then, the noise of a motorcycle roaring past or the sound of a rickshaw spluttering along the lane outside punctuated the silence. But it did nothing to stir the immobile bodies that lay still, like scattered pieces of a broken earthen pitcher. Each lost in their own thoughts, each reflecting on the terms of the transaction. The transaction, or the date, as the girl liked to think of it, had begun with a question that the girl now thought was more of an assumption. For it really could not be answered in any other way but yes. If you were to ask her how it happened, she would have said it all began with a new scarf. You see, it had been only a few months since she had joined the man's workforce, and that day he had called her into his glass cabin. She knew she had been punctual and hardworking and had no reason to fear, yet felt a rising panic grip her throat as she pushed open the glass door. Smoothing her dupatta over her head and holding it close to her skin, she stood waiting. When he pretended not to see her, she cleared her throat. "Yes, sir?" she asked with some trepidation in her voice. The man leaned back in his chair, the creaking of the fox letter under his bulk reminding her of a series of small farts. "Come in, please." She looked up, surprised to hear his voice, which was strangely seductive and husky, unlike his looks, which she had found repulsive and reptilian. "The manager was saying your mother is unwell?" "Sir," she began, but lost her words to a wave of embarrassment. She felt herself blush, for the sick mother had been an excuse to leave early the past few days. Perhaps he mistook her silence for grief, or maybe he knew her kind only too well. But whatever the reason, he asked her if she would like an advance on her salary. The girl had left his glass cubicle with immense relief and just a little spark of excitement. In the coming days, he called her in many times, mostly to ask about her mother and then about her own life. Was she married? Where did she live? Did she like working here? The girl was only too happy to get away from the blank glare of the computer and the oppressive heat of the overhead fan into his air-conditioned office, till one day he asked her if she would like to meet him outside of work. And then the man had, as if to answer his own question, pushed a small square box wrapped in shiny silver paper and adorned with an elaborate bow across his expansive chipboard and formica desk towards her. He did not look at her, and she did not look away. There were very few occasions in her life when she had received gifts, and this overly shiny, glitzy wrapped box appealed to her. Without accepting it outright, she began a guessing game in her head. A perfume? Some chocolate? Jewelry? The man leaned back in his chair, finally glancing up at her. He seemed to be guessing her reaction. Given her non-designer cotton shalwar kameez with the white chiffon dupatta worn loosely around her henna'd hair and patchy bleached skin, whitened unevenly by local fairness creams, He seemed confident that she would accept his proposition. This was despite the fact that in the past there had been one or two young women of the same class and background who had chosen to take the moral high ground. He recalled now how most of the receptionists who came to work for him had some sort of a sixth sense as to what was required, but there had been a few who had pretended not to understand him and had left without notice. He narrowed his eyes, watching her watch the gift. No, she was not their kind. There was something about the way this woman stared for hours at the blank screen of her computer, staring only when the phones rang. A breakup, or an unrequited love, or perhaps some trouble at home, he mused. But whatever it was, if she was searching for something to fulfill her dreams, he would help her. He sat up suddenly, and she stepped back instinctively. Gingerly, he placed his hand on the shiny silver square. Her eyes traveled all the way from the box to the hair covering the back of his hand to the gold of the watch peeking out from beneath his stiff white cuffs, up the length of his short arm, narrow shoulders, thick neck, and to the round, almost football-like head that sat stiffly on his shoulders. He smiled crookedly. She looked away, a dizzying wave overcoming her. What surprised her was not guilt, but the lack of it. Why wasn't she revolted? Where was the disgust? Instead, she felt the prick of excitement, as if she was about to embark on a thrilling adventure. He lifted the lid of the box and pulled out a beautiful silk headscarf. For you, he said. And the rest, you can buy the book and read yourself.
Another great story with a wonderful punchline, so I heartily recommend it. Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for conversation questions now. We have a few minutes left. Raise your hand. I think someone's going to go around.
I think
we
the
have a
lady here had a
mic?
question. And there as well. Yeah. I don't think
Okay,
there's a mic.
I don't think there's a mic.
Yeah.
Sorry. Do you want to
So
just
you
ask
can
your
just,
question?
yeah. Oh, there is a mic. Yeah.
What do you think that Pakistani English writers are writing in what themes? Can you just explain? In what themes they are writing short stories?
Pakistani writers in writing in
What
English?
are the main themes?
Okay. So I think we've been very lucky in the last few days. Pakistani writers are writing about all sorts of things, and especially I'm very proud to say women writers. Like Maha has written a fabulous novel, which is about a very unusual topic. There's Beena Shah has come out with a science fiction novel. Sidra Sheikh wrote a science fiction novel. I just did an anthology of students' work, and they wrote about everything from, trips to a marketplace, to being a Pakistani abroad, to being, I think we have moved on now from those very few limited themes of maybe terrorism or arranged marriage. I think nowadays Pakistani writers are writing about everything. Short story form is still a bit nuanced, I feel. It's still a bit niche. I don't think there are a lot of people doing short story form in Pakistan. There are a few known names, but I can't think of too many people who do short stories. But I think the themes are very diverse. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you that while you were writing these stories, did you feel that hijab itself, when girls take scarf, it's symbolic? It's symbolic of either tradition, either protecting yourself, or it is an ideology abroad. Usually that's what's considered, or it's just a dress code. But for you, when you were writing the book, what did hijab stand for, or personified, or was symbolic of?
So that's a really great question. Thank you. I think for me, when I was writing the book, the hijab was what is hidden. The hijab for me represented What are you hiding? What is it that you don't want to show the world? Not your skin, not your hair, but what is it inside you that you don't want anyone to see? You know, that is what the hijab represented for me. That little space inside you that's hidden, that little story that you don't want anyone to know. That's what I wanted to bring out in the open.
And I think what you do really well is you sort of ground it in the mundane. So it's just women going about their business, the
Yeah.
business of being women
Yeah.
in the world. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, question here.
You know, when we were growing up, what we saw was black burqa with veil or white tent type burqa. But now what we see is hijab. Those women were a certain type of women. One could say they were following the command of the male member of the household. But now we see women wearing hijab and they are on TV also and all that. But can you, since you have done the research, what brought this change? How the burqa got replaced with hijab, and where will it end up?
Okay, thank you. That's another really great question. So there is one story in this collection called The Good Wife, which actually addresses what you're talking about, where a young bride moves to the UK and she's wearing the hijab, and the husband is like, you know, why are you wearing it in UK? Who's going to get aroused looking at you? So, you know, and she was like, that's not the reason why I'm doing it. And for her, it was a political symbol because the hijab has become synonymous with the Muslim woman. Internationally. Where it comes from, I think it comes from, you know, the Saudi influence, the Ziyaira, the Wahhabi influence. So that history is there. And I think that's one of the reasons why the burqa has become eliminated. It's more associated with, you know, Afghanistan, with the old, you know, Lucknow tradition. And now, as we become more and more influenced by the Saudi tradition, you know, the hijab has become more popular. But I think it is a symbol of political resistance as well in many parts of the world. And there are many women who wear the hijab very consciously as a political choice, you know, to establish their identity as Muslims. And that's also something that I've tried to explore through the story, The Good Wife.
The lady in the back, can she get mic? Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting discussion. I was wondering if you think that fiction has a role to play in bringing about societal change, and in writing your stories, if you had a particular agenda, an activist agenda, and how that influenced you, if at all.
Okay, yes, thank you again for a very interesting, thought-provoking question. I think stories matter. I think stories are important. I think stories are very powerful, sometimes more than news or any sort of forced moralization, because stories impact you, they touch you, you know, they create empathy. So yes, I do think stories can be agents of change. Literature can do that. I mean, often, you know, the other day there's a student in my, I mean, homophobia is an issue in our part of the world, yet, you know, I have a student who really enjoyed reading a book about a gay character, and, you know, it made me feel that it had, because he empathized with that character through literature. So sometimes literature can touch you in a way that, you know, mere factual lectures, moralization, academic books, news can't. It's the same when you watch coverage of war. You know, it just becomes numbers for you. Yet you read a story or a novel about war and it affects you, you know. So yes, in that way, I do feel fiction can bring about change. It can be political. However, I think one can try. I think when I was writing this, I wasn't consciously trying to influence anyone. What I was just trying to do was to open up a space for debate. I was trying to create a conversation around this. And whether that will force people to think and bring about change or just awareness or just get people thinking, I think for me that is enough as a writer.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Thanks. I was wondering what kind of reactions you had from people you've shared the book with or from readers who wear hijab.
Okay, so because it looks at all various aspects of the hijab, and actually only few of the characters actually wear the physical hijab in here. So far, it had a launch in Karachi earlier at the other festival. So there was this one young lady who came up to me who wears the hijab, and she's a student, and she could really relate to one of the stories in here about, feeling that just because she wears the hijab, she is supposed to represent the entire Muslim sisterhood, which is not true because her reasons for wearing the hijab are very different. But other than that, I've had some very interesting reactions from men and from older men who have been very scandalized reading a book like this and have actually said, what is a nice girl like you writing about these kind of stories, So that for me has been like really interesting,
I think it's important to say, though, that you make no, you demonstrate no bias one way or another. You're not giving an opinion on what it actually represents in terms of people's choices. You're just examining a world and exploring narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really well pointed out. I mean, it's important to remember that, this is fiction. At the end of the day, these are stories. And these are not my views, disclaimer, right? There's a lady who's been raising her hand for quite a while. Yeah.
You have to wrap up.
So I don't feel that it's the responsibility of a fiction writer to balance anything, because it's not a scholarly work. As I said, I'm not representing anyone. So I didn't think that I need to, balance the book with an equal amount of representation of women who wear the hijab. But it's interesting you say that, and I think in some ways perhaps it is important. There is a story, The Good Wife, where the woman makes a political choice to wear the hijab because she feels that as a Muslim, she must assert her identity through what she believes are the principles of Islam, where she talks about, Allah has, I've been told to cover my head, and these are the principles, these are the fundamentals, and this is what I need to do. So that story is there. Yes, it is there. However, it's not a conscious decision. It wasn't that I went and I said, I will have 6 stories of women who wear the hijab and 6 stories of women who don't wear the hijab, or 3 stories of women who wear the hijab because of religious reasons. But I think maybe, it does have a mix. The women in this collection who do wear the hijab wear it for various reasons, but I think that's just the way it panned out. Yeah.
I think that's a great question to ask Sabyn off the stage, and I think she does address it a bit in the book, but we've unfortunately run out of time, and Sabyn is here after. We can chat further.
But I would love to continue that conversation. I think it's very interesting.
Someone flashing a time over sign at us, so thank you so much. You've been a wonderful and engaged audience.
Thank you so much.
And I'd just like to thank Sabyn
Thank you, Maha.
and congratulate her on her new book.